Welcome again to Educators.com's reading comprehension course. And we're continuing in with our nonfiction reading and how we can actually read complete books instead of simply just essays and stuff like that on SATs. This lesson is called The Demanding Reader. So, to go over this is what we're going to do. We are going to learn how to judge a book by its cover. And I really do mean that in a very literal sense. We're going to judge a book by its cover. Then we're going to go over what the catcher asks. We're going to talk about what it means to really own a book, and then 3 types of note-taking. Here is a book's cover. This is a book called The Deathly Hallows Lectures by John Granger. You can look at it right here. Now, first thing I'm going to notice about this is that it also has a subtitle. And the subtitle reads, and if you can't read it here, that's okay. The subtitle reads as follows: The Hogwarts Professor Explains Harry Potter's Final Adventure by John Granger. So, what do I expect to hear about in this book? Well, I'm definitely going to be hearing about the Deathly Hallows, but then I'm going to hear a professor explain it. One thing I also notice is that in this title there is the word lectures. Now, lectures are normally kind of what I'm doing right now, where it's just a teacher speaking and the students and listeners are just kind of writing down, following along, and taking notes. So I suspect that probably this book is a collection of lectures written down for people to read instead of listen to. On the back of the book, we have the following: John Granger, the Hogwarts professor, has spoken about the meaning and magic of Harry Potter at major universities from coast to coast and is a keynote speaker at fan conventions in the United States and Canada. Now, how much do I know about this guy? Well, I know that he's put a lot of work into doing this, and I know that he's very popular, and I know that this is kind of what he does. That might give me a little bit more clue about what I could find inside the book. Now, judging a book by its cover also means looking at the table of contents. So, if I'm going to just skim a book to figure out what it's all about and what I really want to read, I'm just going to skim the table of contents, and here they are. Chapter 2, Unlocking the Deathly Hallows. We got 5 keys to understand the last Harry Potter novel. Furthermore, we have Chapter 3, we have this article called Choosing to Believe, and this is about the Christian content in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Chapter 4 is Snape's Green-Eyed Girl. We have Dante, the Renaissance, Florence, and the death of the Potions Master. Now, if I'm just reading these, I'm learning to judge the book by its cover by getting a better feel of kind of, well, what's this book all about? Now, why on earth do we judge a book by its cover? Well, we go through this process because when we're researching, when we're reading, when we're going to the library, when we're picking off books, we know that even in our lifetime, we're not going to read everything. And so we're going to judge a book by its cover and just kind of pick out what books might be most relevant to us and what's most important and kind of what's going to help us out the most. And we're going to do that in this very, very short way. So, interestingly enough, reading is a lot like being a catcher, as you may remember from the previous lecture. So the catcher is going to ask questions in his mind of the book as he's reading it. Do you remember the questions for the essays? We got who, what, why, where, when, and how. So, if you go through reading all of those, you can keep on remembering those as you're reading. And if you've read through the essays, you should already be in the habit of doing that. But when we talk about books, there are 4 major questions that we also have to make sure that we ask. And we're going to be going over these for the rest of this lecture, so write all these down if you can. First big question is we got to know, what is the book about as a whole? What is this book about as a whole? Well, what's the Deathly Hallows about? What's the Deathly Hallows lectures about? Well, probably lectures about the Deathly Hallows. What is being said in detail and how? Okay, and once we've read the book and we've read a couple chapters, we're going to pay attention to those important details, those things that keep coming up, and we'll figure out how we're going to answer that question. This last one, 3 we can only answer after we've sufficiently answered 1 and 2. Is the book true in whole or in part? Don't believe everything you read, and I'll explain why later. And then finally, we're just going to ask, well, what of it? Not just what of it to me, but what of it to the author, and what of it to society, what of it to science, what of it to literature, what of it? Why did the author think that writing this book was so important? So let's go with the first one. What is being said about the book as a whole? Well, books have a topic just like all essays do. And then books also have a thesis just like all essays do. However, a book's thesis is probably not going to be compressed into a single sentence. As you read a book, and even after you read a book's preface and a book's introduction, you should be able to get a pretty good idea what the topic and mostly what the thesis is. Keep in mind that any book you read might be just plain descriptive, it might be simply instructive, or it might be persuasive. Turns out later it could also be what's called a theoretical book or practical book, but we're going to go over that in the next lecture. Now, how do we get the answer for what the book is about as a whole? Well, judge a book by its cover. Remember, the Deathly Hallows lectures. What's that about? Well, it's about lectures about the Deathly Hallows. And then we're also going to pay attention to the author's preface or introduction. Most nonfiction books have these, and they have these specifically for this purpose. They're assuming that readers have a lot to read and a lot to do, and they don't want to waste their time on a book that, they don't really care about or something that they don't need to read. So they'll write a preface explaining, hey, here's my book, here's what I'm going to do in this book, and here's why you should care. And so once you get that, you should probably have an idea of exactly what the topic is and what the thesis is. And you should be able to write it out and paraphrase it in 3 or 4 sentences in your own notebook. What is being said in detail? The second big question we ask when we're being demanding readers. What topics keep coming up? Now, remember, in the example we got Deathly Hallows, but if we've read the book or even seen the movies, we know a lot more happens in the Deathly Hallows than just, that one funny symbol and, the story about, the 3 wizards. We got, Dumbledore being not so great. We got, Snape's amazing backstory. We got some kind of, ghosts showing up at the end. We have Harry Potter. Well, I'm not going to ruin it for you. Finally, if we remember from previous reading lessons, we got to know what some important terms and what some important concepts that are defined early in the book. If something is given a definition right away at the beginning, you can bet that that author is going to be referring back to that a lot, and that's an important detail. Is there any particular background to the book that's given in the early chapters? And finally, what arguments are used? Now, how do we get this? How do we answer this question? Well, it turns out we can't just judge a book by a cover in this case. We're actually going to have to read the book very, very closely. And by closely, I mean we are going to annotate like crazy. If you're not sure what techniques are annotating, stay tuned, and I'm going to give those to you later. So, what important concepts are defined early on? Here's an example from the book that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. First, Rowling's novels hold up to a close reading. My first books examine the depth of the series alchemical artistry. Okay, what is that? Narrative misdirection. What is that? Postmodern themes, Christian context, and hero's journey structure. The meaning of these various recurrent symbols and images in the series. Alright, so in this lecture, the author is going to let you know what these terms are, and he's going to explain them to you. So, if you want to know what's said in detail, you would probably highlight, circle, put stars around, paraphrase, write in your notebook what these things are. So the next time you read them, you don't have to refer back to the beginning of the book. You already kind of understand what he's talking about. What background is given? So here we got some historical background to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. We have John Granger talking about William Shakespeare, something called Hermetic Wisdom, alchemical efforts, and some things are happening in Elizabethan England. Okay, so these books were written in the 20th century, so this definitely sounds like a lot of background definition. If I was reading a paragraph like this, and it sounded like it was important background to a very important concept, I might take my pen, and I might draw this big line right across it, and maybe I'd write in the margin notes, IMP BCK for important background, or whatever notation that I choose or you choose that you would think best that would help you remember. Now, once we've done all that annotating, we've understand what the book is as a whole, and we've understand what the book is saying in details, we're actually going to look at the book and we're going to start, well, deciding whether or not it's true. Remember, as you're reading, you'll hear some arguments. Withhold judgment for a bit until you've really understood it and you've done some effective annotating and reading. But we are going to talk about whether or not the book is true in whole or in part. Why do we do this? Because sometimes books just lie. I am not kidding. As I'm giving this lecture, there is a major book that's very controversial right now, and I'm not going to give you the title, and you're probably not even going to be able to find it anymore, because the publishers pulled it from the shelves. I'm going to emphasize this again. The publishers pulled it from the shelves. I can't remember when this has happened, but it is happening now. Very, very rare will a publisher of a book say, this book is so untrue that we can't even justify making money off of it anymore. That's kind of crazy. Now, just because a book is popular doesn't mean that it's true and right. And so keep that in mind and be very careful. Now, how do we judge whether or not a book is true? Well, we have to actually use our critical thinking skills, which I've given you an introduction to in the writing course. And we also have to understand the rules that govern the subject matter, or is sometimes known the methodology. We don't interpret all books the same way. We don't interpret all subject matters the same way. Some have different rules. Here's a quick example. If I was reading a biography on the inventor Nikola Tesla, how would I judge that book? Well, I might judge that book by maybe its historical accuracy. I might judge that book by whether or not the author is pulling up important details. I might judge that author whether or not he's omitting certain facts or why he might be doing that. Very, very important. I'm probably not going to judge it on whether or not it gives me great advice on how to invent one of Nikola Tesla's inventions. However, if I was reading a scientific explanation about combustion engines, I'm going to expect a lot of diagrams. I'm going to expect a lot of dry technical language. I'm not going to be expecting a narrative to the history of combustion engines, but I'm going to expect some very, very dry scientific language that's definite, that's easy, that's curt, probably a little boring, but if it's a scientific explanation, it better be. Maybe themes and symbols of cinema in the 1950s. You know, if we were talking about combustion engines, I bet I could imagine some repeated experiments to tell me whether or not something's true. However, if I'm interpreting themes and symbols in 1950s cinema, there's no repeatable experiments. I mean, I can play the movie again, but I can't, do an experiment asking, well, why did the director choose to do this? Why did the writer write this way? I don't understand. You're not going to judge it or interpret it the same way. Or maybe I'm reading a book that's just very practical, and it's going to give me the psychological laws of persuasion and how to use them. It would be kind of silly if I got upset about this book because it didn't tell me an entertaining story in a Hollywood 3-act. But this book better give examples. It better give me proofs that these psychological laws of persuasion are true, and it should really help me on how to use them. That's how I would judge that book. Our final question, our final big question was the what of it question. So I would like you, after reading a nonfiction book, to actually, judge it, know what's whole and what's in details, and finally ask this. Or you can ask it before. If the entire book was true, or the entire book was false, how will the world be any different? This is what I mean when I ask what of it. Think about that for a second. Finally, you're going to ask, why does the author think it is so important? Hopefully, in the author's preface, he's already given you reasons why he thinks it's important. Only after you've answered these two questions, what does it mean to kind of the world? So how would the world be different if this book had never been published, or if everything in it was false or was not true? How would the world be different? And then two, well, what does the author think it's important? Why does he think it's so important? Once you've answered both of those thoroughly, you can finally ask, does it matter to you? But don't ask that question first when you're reading a nonfiction book. Get an idea of these two first, and then find that last one. That's what we mean when we say, what of it? Here's a great example from Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren on why we ask this, what does it matter to you question last. So, people go to sleep over good books not because they're unwilling to make an effort, but because they do not know how to make it. Good books are over your head. Good books are over your head. They would not be good for you if they were not. And books that are over your head, rarely, unless you can catch up and pull yourself to their level. So what I mean by this right here is that sometimes when readers get a book that's over their head, the tendency is to say, well, this doesn't matter to me, and then they stop reading it. But it wouldn't be a book worth reading if it didn't challenge you and didn't teach you new things and wasn't in some way, in very particular ways, superior to you as a reader. So keep that in mind. Good books are over your head. Now, we're going to go over some quick lessons on annotating. This is a difference between making a book that you own and to making it your own. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that I own this book. I own this book because, well, I paid for it and somebody gave me this book off of a shelf at Borders or Barnes & Nobles or wherever it is I got this. And that means I own this book. But what do I mean when I say your own? Well, when I say your own, and if you can possibly see it, I tend to take a lot of notes in the books that I read. This is actually pretty light notes for me as an educator or me as just somebody who's gone through college. Once you go through college, you never read books without a pen in your hand. And so you annotate and you write in them like crazy. That's what it means to be your own. It's your own when you've annotated and written in it and you've crossed out lines and you've underlined things. Why do we do that? One thing is that it keeps us awake and conscious. If you remember from the writing course, I mentioned that moving your wrist and your hand with a pen in it actually activates part of your brain. So you're going to be more receptive and you're going to understand things better. We take notes and we write in the sides of books because we think in words. We think in words. If I read a book and I don't have an internal verbal word response, I'm probably not quite understanding it as well as I should. So if I have an idea or I have a reaction or I have an insight or a question, I should write that down in the margins in words. Again, that's just writing down our reactions to a book so that we can evaluate it later. Remember, before we judge a book, we have to understand it, but the tendency is to be really quick to judgment sometimes. One thing we can do is we can just write out those questions and say, I'm going to evaluate this argument I just read later, and I'm going to keep on reading for now to be nice to the author and learn from the author. Now, what are the actual skills to annotating? Well, we got underlining, margin lines, and circles. And I'll demonstrate a few of those for you right now. I spoke with Mrs. Rowling retelling of the parable of Voldemort's suffering, and the inconsolable soul fragment was perhaps her greatest accomplishment. Okay, so this sounds important, so I'm going to underline it. I'm not sure what inconsolable means, so maybe I should circle that, and I'll put a question mark at the end of it because I don't quite understand that word. I'll keep reading it, though, and get a better idea. I think this is because there is one message that postmodern readers do not, perhaps cannot hear. There's one message that's really important for these people called postmodern readers? Well, what did that mean? I'm going to put a question mark there because I'm not sure what that means. It's that they will be judged in the afterlife for their thoughts, words, and deeds. Okay, so whatever this is right here, that sounds like a pretty important and challenging message. Do you have a reaction to that? Are you thinking about that right now? Well, I'm going to underline it because it definitely stands out to me. And maybe I'll put a nice explanation mark because that's a huge point and a huge claim that John Granger is making here. So, we can also do numbers and we can also do margin notes. So, I'm going to take the black pen, this one right here, and I'm going to circle numbers and write down numbers when I see them. So, 3 times we see Harry Potter forsake taking things invaluable for their own sake, as he did with the Philosopher's Stone as an 11-year-old. So that's giving me a quick example here. And I know I'm looking for 3 things, and so I'm actually going to number them when I find them. He doesn't want to steal Gringotts treasure. All right, so that must be number 1. Then Harry Potter wins over the Greylegger with a similar show indifference about the gain of the Ravenclaw diadem. All right, so I'll underline that and I'll put that as number 2. And most important, Harry does not pursue either the Resurrection Stone or the Wand of Destiny. Okay, so that must be 3, or maybe 3 and 4. I don't know. Depends on how he puts it together, or maybe you think it should be divided up into 3. So that's an example of numbers and margin notes. So maybe I could write in my margins here something that I've had a reaction to this. So I might say Harry equals unselfish. And there's maybe some argument that he's making about this, but I'm just going to write down in my margin notes here, Harry is unselfish. Now, there are several types of note-taking. The first is structural. When I was writing down those numbers 1, 2, and 3, that was an example of kind of a structural example. All I really am doing there is I just want to know how the author organizes this information. Again, this is also like looking for keywords and circling important concepts that are standing out in definitions. That's all kind of structural. The second type of note-taking is called conceptual. And these are kind of your reactions to the book. Or if you read something that you really like, you're going to paraphrase it in your own words and write it in the margin notes. If you're confused about something or you want to evaluate something later, you might write questions in the margin notes. Those are all conceptual types of note-taking. Now, the third type of note-taking is called synoptical. Since you're in a reading comprehension course, I don't expect you to get to this level, because synoptical note-taking only occurs when you've read several books on the same subject. So let's go back to the Harry Potter example, and he's arguing that there are, well, Christian themes in Harry Potter. But let's say that I had read a couple other articles on Harry Potter and people were saying, well, no, these aren't necessarily Christian themes. They're just kind of really nice moral themes. I might write a question about that and remember an argument I read in another book, and I might write that down in my question taking. But again, synoptical reading is only after you've read several books on the same subject. So if you pick the Harry Potter commentaries, don't worry about synoptical note-taking until you've read like 6 books on that same subject. It's not important. So, making a book your own. Think about this now. By now, do you have a nonfiction book that's worth reading yet? If you haven't, why don't you go check out a library or a bookstore? And then I'd like you to read a chapter and annotate. Now, of course, don't annotate in a book that's at a library. If this is a library book, write down some notes in your own notebook. Unfortunately, you won't be able to do a lot of circling, you won't be able to do a lot of highlighting and underlining, but you can take those margin notes and just put them down in a notebook instead. By the way, if you do that, make sure you write down the page numbers where you found something interesting. So, go ahead and continue doing that with your own nonfiction books, any book that you'd like to read and that's interesting to you, and then we'll continue on with the next lesson at Educator.